I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're brushing off the old tomes as we look at legacy mechanics from Demon Souls that can still be found throughout the rest of the Soulsborne series. Each of FromSoft's games play a little differently from each other, but you can often find a through line of mechanics that make their way through each iteration of their formula. I won't be covering the obvious like archstones being the precursor to bonfires, or anything to do with bosses or areas. Instead, I want to look at gameplay mechanics that we can still see traces of going forwards, as well as a few mechanics they left by the wayside. But first, I want to give a massive shout out to all my new subscribers who recently joined the channel. As of editing this video on the 15th of March, I have over 1,400 of you, and I suspect by the time this video goes out, there may be a few more. You guys are awesome, but I bet over 90% of the people watching aren't subscribed, so let's rectify that, shall we? Without further ado, let's rank the legacy mechanics of Demon Souls, and be sure to tell me your favorite gameplay mechanics down below. Let's start off with a mechanic that I'm sure we're all familiar with in Souls games, that's your method of healing damage. In Demon Souls, the Estus Flask did not exist, and the only way to heal was to use one of 6 different consumable grasses that restored different amounts of health. This meant you could farm for healing supplies in various locations throughout the game, which could give you an easier time on some of the later levels. For Dark Souls, this mechanic was dropped in favor of the Estus Flask, a rechargeable healing source that has since become the blueprint for FromSoft healing going forwards. But that doesn't mean Consumable Healing was dropped. Most games have a few consumable items to restore your health to full, but Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne both see major usage of healing items. In Dark Souls 2, you have the Lifegem system, a series of 3 different consumables that restore health over a period of time. Basic life gems, for example, restore 500 HP across 11 seconds, while the 2 stronger variants restore more health over a longer period of time. You can use multiple life gems at the same time to increase your speed of healing, fitting in right at home with Dark Souls 2's slower game design. While in Bloodborne, you have blood vials. You can only carry 20 at a time, with any others you collect being instantly placed in storage. But what's important is that you collect these consumable heals while out in the world. So unlike the Estus Flask system where you're limited to the healing you start an area with, you can restock as long as you find enemies that drop blood vials or find them in items somewhere in the level. The issue with this system, and the reason I feel it's not made a return in Elden Ring though, is because of farming, the time wasted collecting healing items when you could be playing the game. Dark Souls 2 mitigated this somewhat by including an Estus Flask and by making life gems purchasable from a merchant in Majula, but anyone who's played Dark Souls 2 knows that that Estus Flask is not very reliable. Some games just work better with the consumable system, others work better with the rechargeable healing system, but with Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, and Elden Ring sticking mostly to the latter, I think they'll be phasing out standalone consumable healing for the time being. Perhaps the most infamous mechanics from Demon Souls, World Tendency and Character Tendency, define the experience of FromSoft's first venture. These 2 systems were influenced by the actions the player made on their journey through Boletaria, where if you did good deeds and avoided dying in body form, you could achieve pure white tendency, while if you did the opposite, you'd achieve pure black tendency. Character Tendency, meanwhile, is more focused on player-specific actions with NPCs, invasions, defeating or becoming a Black Phantom, online stuff like that. These 2 mechanics are infamous for being very convoluted and very confusing, and they were naturally left behind in Demon Souls. But the essence of these mechanics do live on in the series. For example, when your world hits pure black tendency in Demon Souls, enemies do more damage, but more importantly, extra Black Phantom enemies would appear. This system was adopted and adapted into Dark Souls with the Gravelord's Servant Covenant, a group whose purpose is to curse the worlds of other players, and if those players happen to be on a New Game Plus cycle, they'll have to deal with extra Red Phantom enemies until the Gravelord's servant who cursed them is slain. You can check out Illusory Wall's YouTube video on the Covenant for more information, it's fascinating stuff. In Dark Souls 2, new Red Phantom enemies will appear on New Game Plus cycles, making areas that little bit harder but only on your second playthrough, or if you use a bonfire aesthetic. So yes, world tendency and character tendency did have an effect on the series, at least for the next 2 games. I'd love to see FromSoft play around with Dark Souls 2's New Game Plus mechanic for future games, as it makes them far more replayable in my opinion, but we'll just have to wait and see. The Nexus is the hub of Demon Souls, a disconnected realm from the rest of the game where you can go to level up, store items, use the blacksmith, chat with NPCs, and just vibe for a little while. And this style of hub seems to be FromSoft's preferred version in their games. Dark Souls 2, 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring all use this mechanic to varying degrees. Dark Souls 2 and Sekiro both have hubs that are interconnected with the main world, Majula and the Dilapidated Temple, but you'd still have to return to them for various reasons, including upgrading gear or your shinobi prosthetic. In Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring, they utilize Demon Souls' system of having the hub be completely disconnected from the rest of the world, forcing you to return each time you need to upgrade gear, equip runes, improve spirit ashes, etc, etc. The only game to really buck this trend was Dark Souls 1, and this makes sense. The interconnected world design of Dark Souls and the lack of warping between bonfires for the first half of the game meant that the hub only needed to serve as a stopping point for NPCs and a central location within the game, as you could purchase a bottomless box and blacksmith tools to upgrade your weapons on the go. I think dedicated hub areas are obviously here to stay, and I'm okay with that. It helps having all your upgrades performable from a single location, and these hubs are often great for housing NPCs while you're following their probably convoluted quest lines. A lost mechanic that hasn't been brought back in the series, and for good reason, is item burden. In Demon Souls, you have a character in the Nexus called Stockpile Thomas, who will carry your burden for you. What a lovely man. What this means is you hand him all your extra items and he holds on to them because you have an item weight limit. Healing grass, consumables, soul items, and that sort of stuff doesn't really weigh much, but once you start finding armor sets, weapons, and especially the different ores, you can find yourself getting over encumbered, which means you can't pick up new weapons. Or items. Or anything. Luckily, there is a ring you can equip to boost your item carrying capacity, but it's more of a pop the ring on, head straight back to the Nexus type of deal. I got into the habit of emptying my inventory every time I returned from an excursion, and at least the devs had the good idea with ores to let them be usable from Stockpile Thomas. So if you leave all your ores with him and go to see one of the blacksmiths, either the one next to Thomas or the one in Stonefang Tunnel, your ores don't need to be in your inventory to use them. However, with the rise of fashion souls and weapon collecting and the sheer amount of new armor sets in later games, this system was removed. And nobody complained. Character weight was already enough of a chore to deal with, so I appreciate the developers seeing a mechanic and thinking, you know what, we don't need to be this cruel. A classic FromSoft trope that started in Demon Souls, the Up Maiden is a staple of the franchise. In Demon Souls, the Maiden in Black channels the souls you collect and gives you strength through her abilities as a demon. So if you want to level up, you need to pop back and have a chat with her. In Dark Souls 1, as mentioned earlier, you had the ability to level up yourself to accommodate for the world design. But in every game since, aside from Sekiro, the Level Up Maiden awaits you ready to boost your levels. The Emerald Herald in Majula, the Firekeeper in Dark Souls 3, the Doll in Bloodborne, and most recently, Melina in Elden Ring. I like that for the most part, these characters actually play a role in their respective games, with the Emerald Herald being a descendant of the dragons, the Dark Souls 3 Firekeeper being able to affect the game's final ending, and Melina is your companion across the entire open world of Elden Ring. The doll is the only character to not affect her game's story, but she has some subtle lore moments if you give her a specific item, and you can sometimes find her praying at the DLC headstone, wink wink nudge nudge. Melina is my favourite of these companions though, as due to her nature as a being, you can summon her at any site of grace instead of returning to the hub. It's basically Dark Souls 1 rules, but you have a cool maiden who gives you a fun horse. I'd also be remiss if I don't mention Emma from Sekiro, who upgrades your healing gourd. It's not technically leveling up, but it is upgrading gear, so I will mention her here. I don't see this trope going away anytime soon, but come on FromSoft. Give us a level up, man! You know you want to. This isn't exactly an underrated mechanic, but I want to acknowledge the weapon upgrade system of Demon's Souls that directly influenced Dark Souls 1. Thankfully, future games did not continue with this system, because if you know anything about either game, you know the weapon upgrade trees are, for lack of a better term, convoluted as fuck. In order to get the 100% trophy for either game, you need to get a fully upgraded weapon in every single upgrade tree, and that meant a whole host of different ore types to find and use, especially in Demon's Souls with a grand total of 13 different upgrade trees all using their own types of ore. And in this original game, some of those final ores that get a weapon to that +5 are incredibly hard to obtain, especially the infamous Pure Bladestone, only obtainable through 2 enemies in 4-1 and 4-2, with an insanely small chance to obtain them even in Black World Tendency when your item discovery rate is boosted. So of course Dark Souls used this system as well, why wouldn't it? There were less ore types to collect, but it's still just as much of a hassle to upgrade weapons in that game as well. Dark Souls 2 did it best by introducing infusions, which replaced the weapon upgrade trees with single-use items that did the exact same thing without needing to go the extra mile. And y'all thought Dark Souls 2 did nothing right. I'm gonna bunch these next 2 notes together because I don't have terribly much to say in regards to them. The first is magic mana. In Demon's Souls you had a mana bar, which was then removed in Dark Souls 1 and 2, but brought back in Dark Souls 3 onwards. If you had to ask me which format I prefer, I think magic mana is more versatile, and with the introduction of combat arts in 3 and Ashes of War in Elden Ring, I think weapon skills and magic have never been more accessible. This isn't to say I dislike how Dark Souls 1 and 2 handle magic. Dark Souls 1's spell charges are incredibly OP, and it's very fun to go through that game as a mage. So for balancing purposes, magic mana wins. Demon's Souls was ahead of its time. It wasn't quite so ahead though when it came to gender-locked clothing. There were some armor sets you could only equip as a male or female, something that was not changed in the remake, a missed opportunity to be sure. I was really annoyed in my current playthrough when I found the rogue armor, and then realized it was a female-only set. As someone who loves playing as a rogue in D&D and other RPGs, felt like a smack in the face to be sure, and I'm very grateful this is another lost mechanic that has not shown up in future games. Let's preach equality here. The last mechanic I want to discuss is the one that inspired this video actually. It's Demon's Souls' soul form and body form mechanic. For those of you that don't know, soul form in Demon's Souls is your default form after you reach the Nexus. You have half health, and depending on world tendency, you can either be stronger in white or weaker in black. To regain your body and your full health bar, you need to kill a boss or use a Stone of Ephemeral Eyes. However, if you die in body form in Demon's Souls, that affects your world tendency negatively, pushing you towards black, which isn't good if you're a new player trying to just get through the levels. This resulted in players suiciding in the Nexus after beating a boss so as not to affect the world tendencies of the Archstones. You can obtain the Cling Ring early in 1-1, which gives you some extra health in soul form, but that means using up one of your 2 precious ring slots. This mechanic of having 2 forms, so to speak, has been used throughout the franchise though. Dark Souls 1 had a hollowed form and a human form, the same with Dark Souls 2 though with different mechanics. Dark Souls 3 has a non-embered and an embered state, and Elden Ring has rune arcs, which don't change your form, but act exactly like the body form in Demon's Souls in that the rune you have equipped will remain active until you next die. But only one of these games replicates the feeling of Demon's Souls' soul form, and that is Dark Souls 2. Say what you will about the game, Dark Souls 2 tried a lot new for the series, and wasn't afraid to experiment. But one aspect of the game that was pretty brutal was the hollowing feature. Every time you die in Dark Souls 2, you hollow further, and your maximum health gets lower and lower until a certain threshold. You can use human effigies to restore your humanity and reset your meter, but there are limited items so you can't rely on them. It gives Dark Souls 2 a very unique difficulty curve that I'm sure was inspired by Demon's Souls. You're running on limited health in both games, but Dark Souls 2 decided to refine and reinvent the system to fit new gameplay, and I don't dislike it. It has its place as an odd little gimmick for an odd little Souls game. But I honestly wouldn't mind FromSoft taking another crack at limited health in future titles, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on Soulform and Hollowing in Dark Souls 2 because it's a fascinating topic. So, what are your favourite mechanics in the From Software catalogue, not just Demon Souls? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching this video. My socials are on screen now, so feel free to follow where you feel so inclined. A massive shout out to my patrons over on the left there. I know you don't get anything really for being a Patreon, but you guys are keeping my channel alive. Thank you so much. Next week, we'll be back in Lordran with a Dark Souls countdown. But about what? You'll have to wait and see. Adios.